Good evening. I'm David Clement, filling in for Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, December 30th. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is being urged by the Atlantic Liberal Caucus to resign as party leader. A letter dated December 23rd was publicly shared yesterday by New Brunswick MP Wayne Long. It says the events that followed the resignation of Chrystia Freeland, along with signals from the opposition parties to declare non-confidence in the government at the first opportunity, make it no longer tenable for Mr. Trudeau to keep leading the party. Conservative MP John Williamson plans to introduce a non-confidence motion at a Public Accounts Committee meeting on January 7th, with hopes that it will be passed and forwarded to the House of Commons for a vote later in the month. And the head of North American Aerospace Defense Command says Chinese and Russian air cooperation in the Arctic has NORAD's, quote, full attention. Those two countries staged their first ever joint patrol in the Arctic last July near the coast of Alaska. U.S. General Gregory Guillot notes it could take decades for them to achieve the level of integration Canada and the U.S. already have, but it's still something that NORAD is watching closely. General Guillot says both Canada and the U.S. need to beef up their Arctic presence through more exercises and campaigning, and that NORAD must increase its ability to detect threats. In South Korea, law enforcement officials are seeking a warrant to detain impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol. This comes as they investigate whether Yoon's short-lived martial law decree this month amounted to rebellion. Investigators plan to question Mr. Yoon on charges of abuse of authority and orchestrating a rebellion. An Israeli hospital says that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has undergone successful prostate surgery. Jerusalem's Hadassah Medical Center said his prostate was removed late Sunday and that he was recovering. Mr. Netanyahu's office had said Justice Minister Yariv Levin, a close ally, served as acting prime minister during the procedure. Doctors ordered the operation after detecting an infection last week, and Mr. Netanyahu is expected to remain hospitalized for several days. With so much at stake, Mr. Netanyahu's health in wartime is a concern for both Israelis and the wider world. And Syria's de facto leader said Sunday it could take up to 4 years to hold elections in Syria, and that he plans to dissolve his Islamist group that led the country's insurgency at an anticipated National Dialogue Summit in the country. Ahmad al-Shara, who leads Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group leading the new authority in Syria, made the remarks in an interview with a Saudi television network. It comes almost a month after a lightning insurgency led by HTS overthrew President Bashar Assad's decade-long rule, ending the country's uprising-turned-civil war that started back in 2011. And while many Syrians are hopeful for a better future for the country, advocates are expressing concern over increasing calls to end refugee claims for Syrians and even forcing Syrians to return home. After the fall of the Assad regime, several European countries announced that they would no longer process refugee claims from Syria, with several right-wing parties throughout Europe calling for the return of all Syrian refugees. Earlier this month, Immigration Minister Mark Miller stated that Canada would continue to evaluate the refugee process. We spoke with Mara Koubé, Executive Director of the Syrian Canadian Foundation, on the challenges for those possibly returning home.
For the asylum seekers or refugees who are in Canada or even in general, as we heard many reports that we were reading from European countries where they're pausing suspending asylum seeker claims at this time, and some like Austria is deporting Syrian refugees at this time, and the conditions on the ground in Syria remain unsafe. And for most refugees to return, there is still lack of basic necessities, basic services, and infrastructure. So Canada's approach to refugee protection must continue to prioritize human rights and recognize the ongoing risks for Syrians on the ground. There's still uncertainty. Everyone is hopeful for a better Syria and better future, but again, there's still no clarity about what the future unfolds. And many of these refugees were displaced, if not once, second, twice, or even 3 times across the span of the past decade. So expecting them to go back now while it's still there's again uncertainty and no clarity, will really risk their lives and would add a lot of pressure on them after all the trauma and everything that they have endured the past decade.
All right, stay with us because when we come back, we're going to be taking a look at the growing debate over H-1B visas in the United States. Donald Trump has praised the use of those visas for skilled foreign workers and sided with his confidant Elon Musk. That and more when we return. US President elect Donald Trump appears to be siding with Elon Musk and his other backers in the tech industry as a dispute over immigration visas has divided his supporters. Mr. Trump praised the use of visas in a recent interview with the New York Post, saying that they bring skilled foreign workers. But the topic has become a flashpoint within his conservative base, with hard right members of Mr. Trump's movement accusing Mr. Musk and others in Trump's new flank of tech supporters of pushing policies at odds with Trump's America First vision. North Korea's leader says that he will be implementing the toughest anti-US policy less than a month before Donald Trump's return to the White House. The prospects for diplomacy between the North and the US were looking good since Trump met with Kim Jong-un on 3 separate occasions during his first stint as US president. North Korea's support for Russia's war against Ukraine could also toss a monkey wrench into efforts to revive diplomacy. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada is investigating after sparks and flames shot from under the wing of a plane that landed hard in Halifax on Saturday night. Nikki Valentine, a Halifax woman who was on the plane, said that passengers felt a massive rumble upon landing at the Halifax Stanfield International Airport. She said the cabin tilted, then they saw sparks and flames, and then smoke started getting sucked into the cabin. Air Canada says that an Air Canada Express flight arriving from St. John's experienced a suspected landing gear issue after arrival and was unable to reach the terminal. The crew and 73 passengers were offloaded by bus, and no one was injured. And South Korean officials plan to conduct safety inspections of all Boeing 737-800 aircraft operated by the country's airlines as they struggle to determine what caused Sunday's plane crash that killed 179 people. The plane, operated by South Korean budget airline Jeju Air, skidded off the runway at Muan International Airport, slammed into a concrete fence, and burst into flames. All but 2 of the 181 people aboard were killed. Aviation expert John Gradick joined us to explain the significance of the crash.
This crash seems to have been a function of the mechanical systems on board the airplane that are participating in landing an airplane kind of failed. The landing gear was not retracted. The flaps weren't extended on the airplane, and it seems that the thrust reversers on the engine on that belly landing did not operate. So there seems to be a combination of systems that are associated with landing that type of aircraft that kind of failed for some reason. Now, is this a Boeing problem? I would hesitate to say it is not a Boeing problem. It is probably something that's due to either a mechanical issue on board the airplane that was caused by a bird strike that I think happened, that was noted by air traffic control. And that bird strike may have affected one of the engines, which may have affected some of the systems on board. So not sure. The investigation, they've got both black boxes, so the investigation will probably give us more detail shortly.
Azerbaijan's president says the aircraft in a plane crash that killed 38 people in Kazakhstan was hit by fire from the ground over Russia and rendered uncontrollable by electronic warfare. The country's president is accusing Russia of trying to hush up the issue for several days, but says it was not shot down intentionally. Now he's making 3 demands to Russia: to apologize to Azerbaijan, admit guilt, and punish the guilty. Their president noted that the first demand was already fulfilled after Russian President Vladimir Putin apologized to him yesterday, but stopped short of acknowledging Moscow's responsibility. And federal officials say that the United States saw an 18.1% increase in homelessness, a dramatic rise driven mostly by a lack of affordable housing, as well as devastating natural disasters and a surge of migrants in several parts of the country. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development said that federally required tallies taken across the country in January found that more than 770,000 people were counted as homeless. That increase comes on top of a 12% increase in 2023, which HUD blamed on soaring rents and the end of pandemic assistance. Among the most concerning trends was a nearly 40% rise in family homelessness. All right, stay with us because coming up after the break, we'll have our weekly Caldwell segment where Brendan Caldwell will be joining us to give us a financial recap of 2024. After that, the world reacts to the passing of former U.S. President Jimmy Carter at the age of 100. And the RCMP is reporting a rise in online predators since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. That and more right after the break. As the new year approaches, many have been reflecting on how 2024 went for them and for the country. And something many Canadians have been tirelessly thinking about is the economy. Canada's financial situation worsened, with the deficit surpassing the Liberal government's original target, reaching $61 billion this past year. And now, with Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland announcing her resignation, Canadians continue to worry about the economy and what 2025 will look like from a financial standpoint. I'm now joined by Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited, for a look back on 2024. Brendan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, David. I hope you did the full-on Dr. Evil, as is a Canadian tradition. $61 billion. I think that's the only way to say a number like that when you're talking. Well, it's the only way to say that.
When it gets that large, you have to add in. Yeah,
you gotta have the Dr. Evil. It's the only way to do it.
So, I mean, in terms of 2024, what surprised you the most regarding the economy and how the stock market performed?
Well, probably the most surprising thing was the Canadian men's Olympic relay team somehow pulling it out of the ninth lane and winning. I wish I was at the Olympics. I didn't medal yet again, but I wish I'd stayed for that race. Watched our hammer thrower, watched Summer, watched us it was fantastic, but I really would have liked to have seen that race live. But of course, if I'd seen it, I probably wouldn't have happened. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle kicks in. In terms of markets, I think it was surprising to everybody. When you say a surprise, by definition, it's something you missed, didn't see, and rarely are they good. That the U.S. market was as strong as it was, that was something. That TD got hit for a $6 billion fine. See how that works, David? $6 billion fine for money laundering, on which if they made 10 grand, I'd have been surprised. So there was a lot of surprising things, good and bad, about last year. One of the things that didn't surprise me was the election of the soon-to-be, again, once in future President Donald Trump.
And I mean, in terms of 2024, are there any moments that stand out to you that have the most impact, an aha moment throughout the year?
The governing factor, the really determining factor for markets and people's behavior economically is interest rates. Interest rates are the price of money. And that there was a sudden cut in the US rates, short-term rates, just before the election. I actually was surprised about that. Because whether it was politically motivated or otherwise, it does mean that the US rates are probably lower than they should be. At least short-term rates are. Longer-term rates are probably higher than they should be. So the yield curve has got this steepness to it, which is good for Wall Street. I don't know if it's good for Main Street. It makes the buying and selling and trading of stocks easier, while the buying and selling of homes, where people actually live, more challenging. So I think the weird move in interest rates is probably going to be the most significant impact going into 2025.
And where do you see the markets going in 2025? And is there anything that would be on your wish list for 2025?
Well, I think for a personal wish list, I usually look back with my family and we do a list of everything that we were grateful for in the previous year and everything we're looking forward to in 2025 or the next coming year. Doing a gratitude list once a year, I found very helpful as a way of reinforcing that I think we have much to be grateful for. So I'm looking forward to doing that with them next year. In terms of markets, I am cautiously optimistic that the rhetoric coming out of Washington at this point will cause Canada, Canadian politicians, Canadian government, but Canadians in general to take a good hard look at how we run our own country and get our own house in order. One should take Donald Trump seriously, but not literally. And I think the serious point that he's making is that nations around the world need to be more self-reliant. And because America intends on being more self-reliant. So he wants business partners, not parasites, as he sees it. I wouldn't put Canada in that category, but that's how America sees it. So we need to find ways to develop our industries, promote entrepreneurship, develop the growth of the economy, not a mere distribution of wealth, but actually creation of greater and more wealth. Canada has historically been good with that, particularly with public companies. And I hope in 2025 we, to again borrow from that great Canadian philosopher Mike Myers, regain our mojo.
Well, Brendan, thank you very much for joining us, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, David.
All right, stay with us. When we come back, we'll have more of your top headlines from around the world, including a memorial for Jimmy Carter. The United States of America is mourning the loss of Jimmy Carter, the longest-lived U.S. president in American history, who died at his Georgia home on Sunday at the age of 100. As reactions poured in from around the world, President Joe Biden said that the world lost an extraordinary leader, statesman, and humanitarian, and added that he lost a dear friend.
What I find extraordinary about Jimmy Carter, though, is that millions of people all around the world, all over the world, feel they lost a friend as well, even though they never met him. And that's because Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds.
Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, posted on X late yesterday, saying that Mr. Carter's commitment to diplomacy and humanitarianism will forever serve as an inspiration. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said in a statement that he had the honor of meeting Mr. Carter a few times over the past decades, and said that he was always kind, thoughtful, and generous with his advice about public service. Mr. Carter served in the U.S. Navy before his one term as U.S. president, from 1977 to 1981. Following his time in the White House, Mr. Carter dedicated his life to humanitarian work and was a major contributor to Habitat for Humanity. Andrew Donaldson from OrdinaryTimes.com has more on the legacy of the former president.
Jimmy Carter is an absolutely fascinating part of the American history and American political history. You're talking about a lifespan that went from the Great Depression to COVID and the post-COVID era we're currently in. That's a lot of history, and he was in an important part of it. Now, some of the hagiography around Jimmy Carter, although he was obviously a very nice guy in person, is a little misleading. His first campaign as Georgia governor got very ugly, but he did pivot. And in a time that was very divisive, he was a Southern governor who got on the right side of things like civil rights. Now, as president, of course, there's going to be a lot of controversy to his legacy. He was a one-term president. A lot of bad stuff happened economically and foreign policy-wise. But economically, there was also a mixed bag as you have a little bit of hindsight to him. He inherited a bit of a mess from the Nixon and Ford years, and he didn't help it, and he gets the blame for that. But he also did some things that proved valuable when we had the economic resurgence in the 80s, like the deregulatory stuff that he did, breaking down the regulatory state and a few things. Now, foreign policy wise, there was a lot of missteps and a lot of mistakes, some like his Iran policy that haunts us to this very day and that we will see in the headlines today and tomorrow and probably in the foreseeable future. But his post-presidency is what really cements his legacy, the way he carried himself, his humanitarian work. He did have controversial opinions on things like foreign policy, especially things like Israel and Palestine. But on the whole, when you look at Jimmy Carter's legacy, you're going to see a man that was trapped in history. He hit in a bad moment. He had a presidency that was controversial, but he had such a long life and so much outside of the White House. The presidency really does feel like something that was maybe third, fourth, maybe even fifth down on the list of things he accomplished in his life. He was married for 77 years. He's going to get a lot of praise. There will be a little bit of the hagiography, but it's an extraordinary life, the longest living U.S. president we've had to date, and it's something to really dissect and praise and think on.
Internet data from the RCMP shows online predators have become a worsening problem since the COVID-19 pandemic. Police say that predators are increasingly seeking out media platforms where children gravitate, prompting an explosion in police caseloads. The RCMP's Integrated Child Exploitation Unit in British Columbia says that rates have almost quadrupled from 2021 to 2023. The upward trend is being seen nationally, with Statistics Canada reporting that online child sexual exploitation reports to police rose by 58% from 2019 to 2022. Those living with disabilities are urging leaders to enshrine accessibility into more newly built homes than the country has historically seen. Canada's federal housing advocate called on Ottawa to build accessibility up front in its national housing strategy in her 2022 to 2023 report. That included recommendations like ensuring all new government-funded housing units meet a minimum criteria of visitability, meaning homes have a level entrance, wider doorways and hallways, and a wheelchair-accessible washroom on the entry-level floor. And a biologist hid 350 audio monitors across Costa Rica's tropical rainforests to spy on endangered spider monkeys in order to help protect them. But she had to go back to collect the data and feed those sounds into artificial intelligence systems that can recognize monkey calls. Now, tech giant Microsoft's philanthropic arm is hoping to supercharge AI-assisted wildlife research with new solar-powered devices that can help capture sounds, images, and other wilderness data for a year or more without human intervention. I'm David Clement. Good night, Canada.